Despicable fake tears at Bondi Beach, using a terrorist atrocity to sell her shitty clothing. On stage at the not sold out Her Best Life retreat for just 122 minutes, she was faking it. This was an acting job. It was for the cameras. She doesn't give a damn about the victims of Bondi Beach.
What if the moment that looked like compassion on camera was actually the turning point that changed how millions of people saw the entire tour? Because what happened in Australia wasn't just another royal visit. It became something far more complicated, far more controversial, and far more revealing than anyone expected at the start. From the very beginning of this Australia trip, there was already tension building beneath the surface, but nothing prepared observers for what unfolded on that final stretch, where emotion, timing, and perception collided in a way that left people asking one uncomfortable question. Were those tears real, or were they part of something carefully managed?
You're like, Meghan, one tear, left eye, go.
Yeah.
Give me 3 seconds.
Yeah, we know. We know that's what you did. As that one said, Meghan's most difficult acting part so far, alongside this video, making it abundantly clear that she was faking it.
Now think about this for a second, because this is where the story starts to shift in a way most headlines don't fully explain. When Meghan Markle arrived at Bondi Beach, the atmosphere was serious, even heavy, due to its connection to a tragic incident that had deeply affected families and the wider community. And on the surface, her appearance seemed respectful, emotional, and appropriate for the moment. Photos quickly circulated showing visible emotion, and for many watching casually, that might have been the end of the story. But if you look closer at what happened next, the timeline becomes impossible to ignore. Within hours, the outfit worn during that exact visit began appearing on an AI-powered retail platform. And that single detail didn't just raise eyebrows, it completely reframed the entire moment for critics and observers alike. Because suddenly the emotional scene and a commercial action were sitting side by side in a way that felt, to many, deeply uncomfortable.
And that is exactly what she did. Meghan just turned a massacre site into an online shopping mall. It really shouldn't need saying, but when you are meeting people affected by an anti-Semitic mass shooting, making a quick buck off the event is a revolting dereliction of one's duty. And then he says, not as a royal, as a human.
So here's the question you need to ask yourself. If a moment is truly about empathy and support, should it ever be followed so quickly by monetization? Because that's where the perception began to fracture, and once that fracture starts, it spreads fast. Observers didn't just focus on that one incident. They started connecting dots across the entire tour, noticing a pattern that had been quietly building, where outfits worn during hospital visits, charity appearances, and emotionally charged moments were later linked to commercial listings, creating a repeated overlap that was becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence. And when a pattern forms, the conversation changes completely. Instead of asking, what happened? People start asking, why is this happening again? Now here's where things take an even more interesting turn. Because while media coverage in some places remained polished and positive, the reaction on the ground told a slightly different story, especially during that rugby match in New South Wales, where instead of excitement or loud, the response was described as quiet, almost indifferent. No strong cheers, no overwhelming support, just a muted reaction that passed quickly and left behind a very different kind of message.
And by the way, no one was happy to see her there either.
In front of a couple of big names in the form of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, just checking in there with Phil Waugh. I believe John Eales is doing a little hosting for the evening as well, Morgs.
Yeah. Not outrage, but something arguably more powerful, disengagement. And let me ask you something directly, because this is important for understanding audience psychology. Which is worse for a public figure, loud criticism or quiet indifference? Because one fades quickly, but the other suggests people have already made up their minds. As the tour continued, carefully timed public displays of affection, hand-holding, smiles, and picture-perfect moments began appearing at key intervals, and while those images projected unity and warmth, critics argued they also had another effect. They redirected attention away from the growing controversy and back towards something softer, something easier to accept. But once viewers start noticing that pattern, those moments don't feel the same anymore. They start to feel strategic. They start to feel placed. And that changes everything. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, there were growing concerns not just from commentators but from within royal circles themselves, where the core issue wasn't just about one event or one decision, but about something much bigger: the blending of public service and personal profit. Because historically, That line was never meant to blur. And once it does, the meaning of every public appearance begins to shift. So now the story is no longer just about Australia, or Bondi Beach, or even that single emotional moment. It becomes about a larger transformation in how these appearances are perceived globally. And this is where I want you to really think carefully. If people begin questioning the intention behind emotional moments, does it matter whether those emotions were real or not? Because perception, once changed, is incredibly hard to reverse. As the tour came to an end, what remained wasn't just a series of events, but a growing narrative shaped by timing, repetition, and contrast between what was shown and what followed. And that brings us to the next part of this story, where things don't calm down, they actually intensify. Because once this pattern became visible, even more past moments started being re-examined under a completely different light. And what people began uncovering raised even more uncomfortable questions. So stay with me here, because what happens next is where this story truly escalates, and where the debate over image, intention, and authenticity becomes impossible to ignore. If you thought that Bondi Beach was the only moment raising eyebrows, then what unfolded earlier in the tour begins to look far less like coincidence and far more like a pattern that had been building step by step, quietly at first, but impossible to ignore once you start placing each moment next to the other. Because here's what most people missed at the time, and this is where the story deepens. Before that final day controversy even happened, there were already signs that something about this tour felt different from a traditional royal visit, and not just slightly different, but structurally different in a way that changed how every appearance was interpreted. Take the hospital visits, for example, where Meghan Markle was seen interacting with children, smiling for cameras, engaging in what appeared to be warm and compassionate exchanges. And on the surface, these moments looked exactly like what audiences expect from public figures connected to humanitarian work. But now let me ask you something that becomes crucial once you understand the full timeline. If those interactions are genuine acts of connection, why do similar patterns keep appearing immediately afterward in ways that feel commercially aligned? Because according to multiple observations during the tour, outfits worn during these hospital visits were also listed for sale shortly after the appearances. And when that happens once, you might dismiss it as unfortunate timing. But when it happens again and again, it begins to reshape how people interpret the original moment. And that's where perception starts shifting, not because of what is directly said, but because of what is repeatedly seen. Now pause for a second and really think about this, because this is where audience psychology becomes powerful. Do people react more strongly to a single controversial act, or to a repeated pattern that slowly builds over time? Because by the time the tour reached its midpoint, observers weren't just watching individual events anymore, they were watching for consistency, looking for whether the same sequence would happen again, appearance first, emotional engagement second, and then some form of commercial follow-up. And once viewers begin predicting what comes next, the entire narrative changes. It stops being spontaneous. It starts feeling structured. And that distinction matters more than anything. At the same time, another layer of the story was unfolding, one that didn't involve products or timing, but behavior, particularly during interactions with children, where some observers pointed out moments that felt slightly off, not dramatically wrong, but just enough to stand out when compared to expectations. There were instances where interactions appeared brief, controlled, and quickly concluded, sometimes with eye contact breaking at moments when a child was still engaged. And while this might seem like a small detail, it becomes significant when placed within a larger narrative of perception and authenticity. So here's a question worth asking. Can small behavioral details influence how people judge a much larger public image? Because in isolation, probably not. But when those details repeat across multiple appearances, they begin to reinforce a broader impression. Meanwhile, comparisons inevitably started emerging, not necessarily as direct criticism, but as contrast, especially with Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose style of engagement has long been described as more grounded, more patient, and more visibly reciprocal in interactions, particularly with children. And whether those comparisons are fair or not isn't even the central issue here. The real issue is that they exist, and once audiences start comparing, they don't stop. Because comparison is one of the strongest drivers of public perception. And once one figure is seen as more natural, the other is automatically placed under greater scrutiny. Now let's move into another critical moment, because this is where things start to escalate beyond just perception and into narrative control. Throughout the tour, there were multiple instances where carefully timed images began circulating at key moments, photos of affection, unity, closeness, and while those images projected stability, critics began suggesting that they also served another purpose, shifting the focus away from controversy and redirecting it towards something emotionally positive. But here's the problem with that strategy, and this is something many public figures underestimate. Once audiences recognize that pattern, those same images lose their emotional impact. Instead of seeing authenticity, viewers begin to see timing. Instead of feeling connection, they start analyzing intent. And that shift is incredibly difficult to reverse. So let me ask you directly, because this is where your perspective matters. When you see repeated emotional moments followed by strategic image releases, do you feel reassured, or do you become more skeptical? Because by this point in the tour, skepticism was no longer limited to critics or media commentators. It had started spreading into general audience perception, which is far more powerful and far more difficult to control. And while all of this was happening publicly, behind the scenes, another tension was quietly building, one tied to a much larger issue that goes beyond this single tour. The long-standing principle that public service and personal profit should not overlap. This wasn't just a casual guideline. It was a foundational idea reinforced at the Sandringham Summit, where Queen Elizabeth II reportedly made it clear that combining these two elements would eventually create exactly the kind of confusion now being seen. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Meghan Markle, bigger than Prince Harry, and even bigger than this tour itself. Because now we are looking at a structural question. What happens when that boundary disappears? What happens when audiences can no longer clearly separate service from strategy? And most importantly, what happens when every future appearance is viewed through that same lens? Because once that line is blurred, it doesn't just affect one moment, it affects all moments that come after. And that is exactly what began happening as the tour progressed. Observers weren't just reacting to what they saw, they were anticipating what might follow, questioning motives, analyzing timing, and slowly shifting from passive viewers into active critics. And that transformation changes everything. Because when an audience stops simply watching and starts analyzing, the entire dynamic shifts. Now the story is no longer controlled by appearances. It is shaped by interpretation. And interpretation is unpredictable. As the tour moved forward, what once looked like isolated incidents started forming a consistent narrative, one that connected hospital visits, public engagements, commercial listings, and carefully timed imagery into a single thread that critics argued was impossible to ignore. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because just as this pattern was becoming clearer, another moment began to unfold that would amplify everything even further, not through action, but through reaction. Because sometimes, what people don't say, or how they respond quietly, reveals more than anything done in front of cameras. And that's exactly what happened next, as public response shifted in a way that no press release or polished image could fully control. So stay with me, because what comes next doesn't just add to the story, it reshapes it completely, and it forces a much bigger question that goes far beyond Australia. Can public trust, once questioned, ever truly be restored? If you thought the turning point of this story was what people saw on camera, then what happened next proves something far more powerful, because the real shift didn't come from headlines or even criticism, it came from something much quieter, something far more difficult to control, and that was the way ordinary people began reacting in real time. Because here's the moment that changed the tone completely, and it didn't involve speeches, statements, or carefully curated photos. It happened inside a stadium, during a rugby match in New South Wales, where the crowd wasn't gathered for a royal appearance. They were there for the game, for the energy, for the atmosphere that usually defines these events. And yet, when Meghan Markle and Prince Harry appeared on the big screen, what followed wasn't outrage, it wasn't excitement, it wasn't even a dramatic reaction that could be easily interpreted. Instead, it was something far more telling. A muted response that passed quickly, almost like a ripple that never became a wave. Now pause for a moment and really think about what that means, because this is where audience psychology becomes critical. What does it say when a public appearance doesn't trigger strong emotion in either direction? Because silence, especially in a crowd environment, is rarely accidental. It usually means something has already settled in people's minds. And here's the question I want you to consider carefully. Is quiet indifference more damaging than loud criticism? Because criticism keeps you in the conversation. Indifference slowly removes you from it. As observers reflected on that moment, many began describing it not as rejection, but as disengagement, a subtle but powerful shift that suggests people were no longer reacting in real time. They were simply observing, processing, and moving on. And that is a completely different kind of response. At the same time, another layer of the story began to unfold.
And guess what? The poor folk inside who had paid literally thousands and thousands of dollars in order to attend with Meghan at the unfinished Intercontinental Coogee Beach Hotel
through the retreat event known as Her Best Life, which had been positioned as a premium experience, something exclusive, something that would attract strong interest and high engagement. But what actually happened raised a new set of questions. Reports suggested that despite claims of strong demand, tickets had not fully sold out, and last-minute promotions were still being pushed, creating a visible gap between how the event was presented and what people were seeing in reality. And when Meghan appeared at the event, the situation didn't stabilize, it intensified. Because her presence lasted just over 2 hours before she left to attend the rugby match, and for attendees who had paid significant amounts expecting a full experience, that short appearance didn't go unnoticed. So let me ask you something that becomes important here. When expectations are set at a premium level, how much does delivery matter in shaping long-term trust? Because in high-visibility situations like this, perception is built not just on what is promised, but on what is experienced. And when those two don't align, it creates a gap that audiences remember. Now here's where things start connecting even more clearly, because this wasn't just about one event or one reaction, it was about consistency, or rather, the growing perception of inconsistency between messaging and reality. On one side, there was the image of humanitarian engagement, emotional connection, and public service. On the other side, there were commercial elements, short appearances, and timing decisions that didn't always match that image. And when those two sides exist simultaneously, audiences don't ignore the contradiction. They analyze it, they question it, and eventually, they form their own conclusions. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, reports suggested that within royal circles, there was increasing concern, not necessarily expressed publicly, but present in private discussions, particularly around how these patterns might impact the long-term perception of the monarchy itself. Because this is no longer just about individuals. It's about the institution. And institutions rely on one thing more than anything else: trust. So here's a deeper question I want you to think about. When public actions begin to blur the line between service and strategy, what happens to that trust over time? Because trust doesn't collapse instantly. It erodes slowly, through repeated moments that create uncertainty. And uncertainty changes how every future action is interpreted. As the tour progressed, another interesting dynamic began to emerge, one that involved media coverage itself, where some outlets presented the tour in a consistently positive light, while others highlighted the growing criticism and inconsistencies. And that contrast created a new layer of tension, not just about what was happening, but about how it was being reported. Because when there is a gap between media framing and public perception, audiences don't just consume information, they start comparing sources, questioning narratives, and forming independent judgments. And once that happens, controlling the narrative becomes significantly harder. Now let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture, because this is where everything begins to connect. We have emotional appearances followed by commercial actions. We have premium events with questionable delivery. We have muted public reactions instead of strong engagement. And we have growing internal concern about long-term impact. Individually, each of these might be manageable. But together, they form something much more significant. A pattern that is shaping how this entire tour is being remembered. And once a narrative like that takes hold, it doesn't disappear easily. So let me ask you directly, because this is where your interpretation matters. Do you think this tour will be remembered for its intentions, or for the questions it raised? Because history doesn't just record events. It records perception. And perception is what defines legacy. As the final days of the tour approached, it became clear that the conversation was no longer just about what happened, it was about what it all meant, and more importantly, what it might signal for the future. Because if these patterns continue, they don't just affect one tour, they influence how every future appearance will be viewed, analyzed, and judged. And that brings us to the next phase of the story, where the focus shifts again, this time towards something even more complex, something that goes beyond public reaction and into long-term consequences. Because what happens after the cameras are gone, after the tour ends, and after the headlines fade, is often where the real impact begins to take shape. So stay with me, because what comes next isn't just about reflection, it's about what this entire situation could mean moving forward, not just for Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, but for the monarchy itself, and for how public trust is defined in a modern world where every moment is seen, shared, and scrutinized. If you thought the biggest impact of this tour was what people said during it, then what began happening after it ended reveals something far more serious. Because the real consequences of moments like these don't unfold instantly, they build quietly, shaping perception long after the cameras are gone and the headlines have moved on. Because here's the uncomfortable reality that started to emerge once everything settled. This was no longer just a discussion about one controversial visit or one questionable decision. It had evolved into a much larger conversation about credibility, consistency, and the long-term meaning of public roles in a modern world where every action is tracked, compared, and remembered. And let me ask you something right at the start, because this question sits at the center of everything. When people begin to question intention, not just action, can any public figure fully regain that trust? Because what this tour exposed, more than anything else, was a shift in how audiences process what they see. In the past, emotional moments would often be accepted at face value, especially when connected to charity or tragedy. But now, audiences are no longer passive. They are analytical, they observe timing, they compare patterns, and they ask deeper questions about what happens before and after those moments. And that shift changes the entire playing field. Because once people begin analyzing instead of simply reacting, every future appearance carries more weight, more scrutiny, and more risk. Now here's where the story becomes even more complex. Because this isn't just about public opinion anymore, it's about institutional impact, particularly when those actions are still indirectly connected to the royal brand, whether formally or informally. Because even without official roles, that association continues to carry influence, visibility, and credibility. And that creates a unique situation where actions taken independently can still reflect back on the institution itself. So here's the deeper question you need to think about. If the connection remains, but the structure does not, who is responsible for maintaining the standard? Because that gap between connection and control is exactly where tension begins to grow. Reports suggest that within royal circles, particularly around Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, there is increasing awareness of this issue, not necessarily expressed publicly, but present in how future risks are being evaluated. Because the concern is not just about what has already happened, but about what could happen next if similar patterns continue. And when future leadership is thinking in those terms, it tells you something important. This is no longer seen as a temporary situation. It is being viewed as a structural challenge. Now pause for a moment and consider this, because it's critical to understanding what comes next. If a pattern is identified but not addressed, does that pattern become the new normal? Because silence, especially at an institutional level, is never neutral. It sends a message. And in this case, the message many observers are interpreting is that while there may be concern, there is currently no direct intervention. And that creates space for the same behaviors to continue. Meanwhile, outside institutional circles, the broader public conversation has also shifted in a noticeable way. It is no longer dominated by strong emotional reactions or polarized debates, but by something more measured, more analytical, and in many ways, more decisive. People are no longer asking, "What happened?" They are asking, "What does this mean going forward?" And that shift is significant, because it moves the conversation from reaction to judgment. And judgment tends to last longer. At the same time, another important detail has started to gain attention, one that connects directly to long-term sustainability: the performance of commercially driven events and ventures associated with the tour. Reports around the Her Best Life retreat, including unsold tickets and last-minute promotions, have raised questions about demand, pricing, and audience alignment, suggesting that the current model may not be as stable as it appears on the surface. And when commercial success becomes uncertain, it adds another layer of pressure to an already complex situation. So here's a key question to consider. If public trust begins to decline at the same time as commercial performance weakens, what happens to the overall strategy? Because those two elements are deeply connected. Trust drives interest. Interest drives engagement. And engagement drives sustainability. If one weakens, the others often follow. Now let's take this one step further, because this is where the long-term implications become even clearer. Every public figure operates within a cycle of perception, where each appearance builds on the last, either reinforcing credibility or gradually eroding it. And once that cycle starts moving in a negative direction, reversing it requires more than just new appearances. It requires a fundamental shift in how those appearances are structured and perceived. And that is not easy. Because perception is not controlled by intention alone. It is shaped by repetition. So let me ask you directly, because this is where your perspective becomes important. Do you think audiences are more likely to forgive a single controversial moment or a repeated pattern that suggests consistency? Because history tends to show that patterns carry far more weight. As we move toward the broader implications, another critical factor comes into play, and that is the evolving relationship between media coverage and public perception. Because when those two align, narratives become stable. But when they diverge, when coverage presents one version and audiences experience another, trust in both begins to shift. And that is exactly what appears to be happening here. Some coverage continues to frame events positively, focusing on intention and presentation. Meanwhile, public reactions, especially those observed in real environments like the rugby match, suggest a more subdued and uncertain response. And that gap creates friction, because audiences begin to rely less on external narratives and more on their own interpretation. And once that shift happens, it becomes much harder to influence perception through traditional channels. Now here's where everything comes together, because this is no longer just about a tour, or a series of events, or even a public figure. It is about a broader transformation in how trust is built, maintained, and lost in a modern, highly connected world, where every moment is recorded, every pattern is noticed, and every inconsistency is amplified. And that leads us to the final and perhaps most important question of all. What happens next? Because this story doesn't end with the Australia tour. In many ways, that was just the beginning. The real story is what follows, how future appearances are structured, how perception evolves, and whether the current trajectory continues or changes direction. And that's exactly where we're heading next, because the final part of the story doesn't just look at what happened, it examines what it all means moving forward, and whether the line between image and authenticity can still be clearly defined, or whether it has already been permanently blurred. And just when it feels like every angle of this Australia tour has already been examined, the final layer of the story reveals something even more powerful, because what we are really looking at is not just a sequence of events, but a turning point in how public figures are understood, judged, and remembered in a world where perception moves faster than intention. Because here's the reality that is now impossible to ignore. This tour didn't end when the couple left Australia. It continued in the minds of millions of people who watched, compared, questioned, and ultimately began forming a much more fixed opinion about what they had seen. And let me ask you something right here, because this question defines everything that follows. When an audience starts watching with skepticism instead of trust, can any future appearance truly reset that perception? Because that is the challenge now. Not visibility, not media coverage, but belief. As the dust settled, what remained was not one headline or one controversial clip, but a collection of moments that, when combined, created a very specific narrative. Emotional appearances followed by commercial links, premium events followed by questions about delivery, public engagements followed by muted or uncertain reactions. And once those pieces are connected, the story begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a consistent approach. Now think about this carefully, because this is where long-term impact is decided. Do audiences remember isolated events, or do they remember patterns? Because patterns create identity, and identity shapes legacy. At the same time, there is another dimension to this that goes beyond criticism and into something more structural, something that affects not just individuals, but the entire system they are connected to. Because even without formal royal duties, the association still carries weight, still influences perception, and still shapes how actions are interpreted globally. And that creates a situation where every decision operates on two levels, personal and institutional. So here's the deeper question you need to consider. If personal actions continue to reflect on a larger institution, how long can that balance exist without clear boundaries? Because history has shown that unclear boundaries rarely remain stable. They either tighten or they collapse. And right now, many observers believe this situation is approaching a point where some form of clarity will eventually be required. Meanwhile, another shift is quietly happening, one that may be even more significant than any headline or public reaction. The shift from emotional engagement to analytical viewing. Because audiences are no longer simply reacting to what they see. They are studying it. They are comparing timelines. They are identifying patterns. And once that behavior becomes widespread, It fundamentally changes how influence works. So let me ask you directly, because this is where your perspective matters most. When viewers start analyzing instead of feeling, does the power of emotional storytelling begin to weaken? Because if the answer is yes, then the entire strategy behind public appearances has to evolve. Otherwise, the same methods that once created connection may now create doubt. As we move toward the broader implications, another critical factor comes into focus, and that is sustainability, not just in terms of public image, but in terms of long-term viability. Because maintaining visibility requires more than attention. It requires consistency. It requires alignment between message and action. And most importantly, it requires trust. And if trust begins to erode, even slowly, it affects everything connected to it. Audience interest, media framing, commercial success, and future opportunities. Now consider this for a moment, because it brings everything together. If trust, perception, and performance all begin shifting at the same time, what happens next? Because that combination rarely stabilizes on its own. It usually forces change, one way or another. And that is exactly where the story is now positioned, at a point where the next phase will not be defined by what happened in Australia, but by how those events influence what comes after. Because future appearances will not be viewed in isolation anymore. They will be viewed in context. Every gesture, every event, every decision, all connected back to this pattern that has now been clearly established. And once that context exists, it doesn't disappear. So here's the question that ultimately defines everything moving forward. Can perception be reshaped once a pattern has been recognized, or does that pattern become the new lens through which everything is seen? Because that answer will determine not just the next chapter of this story, but the long-term direction of everything that follows. And as we reach the end of this breakdown, one thing becomes clear. This was never just about a tour, or a moment, or even a single controversy. It was about a shift. A shift in how audiences engage. A shift in how public figures are evaluated. And a shift in how trust is built, challenged, and sometimes lost. But now I want to hear from you, because this is where your voice becomes part of the conversation. After everything you've seen, everything we've broken down, and every pattern we've explored, do you believe this was misunderstood? Or do you think the reactions reflect something deeper that can no longer be ignored? And more importantly, do you think public trust, once questioned at this level, can ever fully return? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is one of those stories where perspective matters more than ever. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more deep, high-level analysis that goes beyond headlines and into the real dynamics shaping these stories, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because the story doesn't end here. In fact, if anything, this is just the beginning of a much bigger conversation.